Welcome back to Chinese 270, China and the West. Where had we left off last week? We had, of course, accompanied Marco Polo to Cathay and Mangi, and we had traveled in his company along the banks of the Grand Canal, and we had ventured into the city of Hangzhou, right, that he called Xinzai or Qinzai. And we had marveled at the produce and markets and sights of the city. And then, of course, I had left you with a bunch of questions, right? I had asked you to reflect on this question: what was the effect of Marco Polo's account on readers back in Europe? And what effect did it have on the emergence of the idea of China, right? This notion of this cultural entity in the East, of which the Europeans knew so little. And of course, we had discussed how Europeans imagined this place to look like. And we had looked at some depictions, later depictions from the 15th, 16th century that artists had done to essentially illustrate Marco Polo's account. And we sort of had wondered a little, right, why these places didn't really look like China, right? They looked really more like European landscapes and cities. And even the people right here, the Khan, right, looks more European or maybe Turkish, Middle Eastern, right? Of course, these European artists had no way of imagining what these places really looked like. So they really only could go by what Marco Polo told them. The impact that Marco Polo's account had really was very profound, though. Here we have a map from 1448 called the Fra Mauro map. Fra Mauro was a monk and cartographer from the island of Murano near Venice. It's where beautiful glass comes from, even to this day, beautiful jewelry and glass blown on that island. And the map was made for the rulers of Venice and Portugal, two main seafaring nations of the time, and it actually integrated knowledge of Asia that, Fra Mauro had probably glanced from Marco Polo's account. So this is the map. If we turn it upside down, it kind of looks a lot more like a map of the world, right, with Europe here and Africa and the Asian continent. And up here, this is where Fra Mauro located, for example, Dadu, the capital of Kublai Khan, near today's Beijing. And if we zoom in a little more, we actually can see some of the place names, right? Here is, he calls it Dandu, right? And then here, of course, we have the term Chatayo or Katayo, right? Which, of course, we now know was used to some degree interchangeably with Cathay, but especially the northern part, right, where the Mongols were dominant and from where they had conquered the rest of China, right? That part mostly south of the Yangtze that Marco Polo referred to usually as Mangi or Manji, right? And this term could actually be seen on European maps for a long time. So here is a map from the 16th century, 1570, by Abraham Ortelius of Antwerp. And he actually, if we look, he already uses the term China as well, right here. And then here we have again that Katayo, right, or Cathay. And then here we have Mangi, right? And it's next to Santon, which is most likely Shandong, right? And then here we have Japan. Now, we will continue to revisit this question of how to call this place that we now know as China, right? And we will see, especially in the next few weeks, that this term really took quite some time to format and to have the same meaning to Europeans or Westerners as it does today. Now, I already said that Marco Polo's account really had, a big impact back in Europe. For example, it inspired Portuguese and Spanish explorers to find a sea route to India and China. And legend has it that Columbus carried a copy of Marco Polo's book with him on his journey to the Indies, right? He, of course, wasn't heading for America. He was, of course, trying to find that sea route to India. But we will talk more about that in the following week and the week after, when we talk about the Portuguese and the Jesuits. Today we want to talk about a Chinese explorer. And here we actually have in the foreground a Portuguese or Spanish galleon from around that time, the 15th century. Probably would have been about, 90 feet long, 35 meters. And in the background there, you have a Chinese ship from that period, or what most people, historians now think a ship like that might have looked. And of course, it dwarfs the European vessel, right? We think that it might have been at least 2.5 times as long, right? These treasure ships that we already talked about. Well, here is our litmus test, right? I've already told you, if you want to see if something is really important, has it made it on a stamp? Well, these treasure ships clearly have made it on a stamp, so they are important, which is why we're going to dedicate a whole class to them. So for this week, we have 2 readings. A short one by a historian called Stuart Gordon, and it's called Treasure and Treaty, Ma Huan 1413 to 1432. And I want you to read this, and there is going to be a little quiz, a reading quiz, that comes right after the reading. It's quite easy, right? I just want you to reflect a little bit on the text and what you glimpse from it. The main reading for today is actually an account by someone called Ma Huan, and the account is called The Overall Survey of the Oceans and Shores, Yin Ya Sheng Lan. And that is for the Forum Post, and I will say a little bit more about that later, but you might want to read these first, or you want to listen to the lecture first. It doesn't really matter. If you do read the text first, it probably, and you know very little about Zheng and Ma Huan, you might get a little bit more out of the lectures. So we gotta talk a little bit more about Chinese history to contextualize what's happening this week. So we had talked about the Mongols, and we had talked about the Yuan dynasty, and now, and for the next few weeks, we are going to turn our attention to the Ming dynasty, or the Great Ming, Da Ming, which ruled China from 1368 to 1644. Now, the last years of the Yuan dynasty saw massive flooding of the Yellow River that, as it often has, led to famines and consequently to peasant rebellions that weakened the empire. Also, rampant inflation and ethnic resentment accelerated the demise of Mongol rule. And eventually, one Zhu Yuanzhang, a rebel leader, eventually founded the Ming dynasty and ruled as the Hongwu emperor from 1368 to 1398 from the capital in Nanjing, right? So he moved it from the north to Nanjing. Now, as you can see from this map, even though the territory under Ming control was considerably less than under the Mongols, under the Yuan, it was still the largest empire in the world at the time. It had a standing army of about 1 million, and the world's largest docks also in Nanjing. More about that later. And in the 1600s, the Ming ruled over around 250 million inhabitants, more than the combined population of Europe, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire at the time. Now today we are most interested in the Yongle Emperor, 1402 to 1424, who was the third ruler of the Ming dynasty. And he established Beijing as a secondary capital. He constructed the Forbidden City. That, right, we've looked at this before. And he did a bunch of other things. He restored the Grand Canal. He oversaw a meritocracy that used imperial examinations for official appointments. The study of Confucian classics became the basis for success in this ever-growing government bureaucracy, and we'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks. That'll be very important. While the early Ming was really an agrarian empire, it also had dense urban centers where commerce and industrial production was thriving. Printing and book production flourishes. An estimated 10% of the male population during the late Ming had attained a high level of education. Domestic and external trade was highly developed, with the main commodities being rice, cotton, tea, raw silk, textiles, and porcelain. We've already talked about porcelain once before, right? I had shown you some Sung Dynasty porcelain, and I think I had encouraged you to go and visit the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. Well, here is some Ming Dynasty porcelain that was exported really all over Asia, the Middle East, found its way as far as Europe, and it's known, right, for this cobalt blue on white. And there's plenty of that in the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, if you're curious. Now, while the first emperor, the Hongwu emperor, had promoted the establishment of a stable, self-sufficient agrarian society and banned ocean shipping, the Yongle emperor, right, our emperor, the emperor we are really curious about this week, had lifted that ban. And wanting to bolster his legitimacy by way of a series of diplomatic missions, he appointed the eunuch Zheng as the admiral who between 1405 and 1433 undertook 7 voyages, and that, of course, is the topic of this week's lecture. So we will be looking a little closer at these journeys, 7 of them in total, that took him and these huge ships that he commandeered to, through the South China Sea to South Asia, what is now Indonesia, over the Bay of Bengal to India, over the Arabian Sea, all the way to the Middle East and the African coast. And more about that in our second lecture, so I will see you shortly.